Talk about a baby's first birthday party in Korea. Talk about a bad day, even the ice cream tastes bad. Talk about a bad day, even the ice cream tastes bad. Talk about a car accident you had in the past. Talk about a dine and dash. Talk about a lot of lame jokes. Talk about a time when a delivery came late. Talk about a time when you failed on a test. Talk about a time when you got a medical checkup. Talk about a time when you had a fender bender. Talk about a time when you had cramps. Talk about a time you burnt food by accident. Talk about adding insult to injury. Talk about being in the tank. Talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Talk about being the butt of the joke. Talk about being thrown in at the deep end. Talk about being ungrateful. How could you do this to me? Talk about Blumpkin anymore because it's so disgusting. Talk about burn the candle at both ends. Talk about calling in the cavalry. Talk about closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. Talk about crap. Try listening to Stella Needman tell the story of her and Rod Steiger for the 100th time. Talk about drama, this was like an episode of EastEnders. Talk about every aspect of it. Talk about finding a needle in a haystack. Talk about getting shit-faced. Talk about hair of the dog. Talk about hitting below the belt. Talk about household chores. Talk about the impact of Yoon Suk-yeol's presidency on South Korea. Talk about Yoon Suk-yeol's stance on economic policies. Talk about Yoon Suk-yeol's approval ratings over time. Talk about the controversies surrounding Yoon Suk-yeol. Talk about Yoon Suk-yeol's approach to national security. Talk about the public perception of Yoon Suk-yeol. Talk about the history of martial law in South Korea. Talk about the legal basis for declaring martial law. Talk about the effects of martial law on civil liberties. Talk about past instances of martial law around the world. Talk about the role of the military under martial law. Talk about how martial law impacts democracy. Talk about the potential consequences of declaring martial law today. Talk about the political implications of martial law. Talk about how the media operates under martial law. Talk about historical resistance movements against martial law. Talk about the different types of love. Talk about what makes love last. Talk about how love influences our lives. Talk about the difference between love and infatuation. Talk about love in literature and films. Talk about the challenges of long-distance relationships. Talk about how love changes over time. Talk about love and sacrifice. Talk about cultural differences in expressing love. Talk about self-love and why it is important. Talk about the importance of friendship. Talk about what makes a good friend. Talk about the difference between childhood and adult friendships. Talk about how to maintain lifelong friendships. Talk about the role of trust in friendship. Talk about the impact of social media on friendships. Talk about friendships that turn into romantic relationships. Talk about the hardest part of losing a friend. Talk about how different cultures view friendship. Talk about ways to make new friends as an adult. Talk about the role of politicians in a democracy. Talk about the importance of voting in elections. Talk about how political ideologies shape governments. Talk about the pros and cons of a two-party system. Talk about the impact of social media on politics. Talk about political scandals and their consequences. Talk about the rise of populism in modern politics. Talk about the role of political debates in shaping public opinion. Talk about the relationship between politics and the economy. Talk about how young people can get involved in politics. Talk about how hairstyles change with age. Talk about how often you meet your friends back from school. Talk about how people have become more height conscious. Talk about incidents that happened due to abusive comments. Talk about keeping your feet on the ground. Talk about landing on your feet. Talk about large people as a no-no at my house. Talk about living in the past. Talk about longer play and other differences are irrelevant. Talk about luck. Talk about making a spectacle of yourself. Talk about manners regarding cell phones. Talk about mean. She didn't even buy me a card. Talk about my wife again, I'll kill you. Talk about online banking and mobile banking. Talk about pissing your money away. Talk about problems people experience when they rent a house or an apartment. Talk about pushing one's luck too far. Talk about putting a positive spin on things. Talk about rain. Talk about rubbing salt into a wound. Talk about safe sex with your partner before you have sex. Talk about selfish. Talk about sending gifts via smartphone. Talk about setting the bar low. Talk about shoot yourself in the foot. Talk about siding with the people. Talk about something else. Talk about subjects on which you are likely to agree and which make you feel good. Talk about taking it out of context, Alan. Talk about that and the kind of articles you've run so far that generate the most interest. Talk about the cure being worse than the disease. Talk about the last time you went to a funeral. Talk about the pot calling the kettle black. Talk about the rising number of people who live by themselves. Talk about trying to finish up a job. Talk about wet blanket. Talk about what you heard here. Talk about when you got burned out. Talk about when you moved. Talk about when you renovated your home. Talk about words I never thought I'd hear you say. Talk about your experience with the Monday blues. Talk about your fears with your family or friends. Talk about your geopolitical things. Forget it. Talk about your mom and dad. What are they like? Talk about your nerve. Talk about your sex life and relationship. Talk about your song in a group chat room. Write. Talk about yourself.